Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean Macmillan, I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again. Okay, so this video will be an introduction to digitisation. Okay, so first of all, what is digitisation? Digitisation is essentially the process of converting analog or physical materials into a digitally accessible format. So for example, scanning a page from a book could be described as digitising that page in the book. The output from a digitisation project is often known as a digital representation, but other names can vary. So for images, this might mean converting items to, say, a JPEG or a TIFF. For audio materials, it might be to an MP3, or for audiovisual materials, it may be an MP4, but of course a vast variety of other formats do exist. And also it's worth noting that digital preservation and digitisation are not the same. Digital preservation is something completely different, but what I would say is that if you're serious about digitisation and you plan on keeping large numbers of digital objects, then digital preservation is almost unavoidable. Okay, so the main advantage and incentive for digitisation is, I would say, access. Digitising your collections allows you to make materials accessible to almost an unlimited number of people in almost all parts of the world. So for example, I worked in a previous place that would receive information requests from all over the world, from other continents, from America, from Japan. And one of the real advantages we had is that we could digitize our items and then send it over. So that this was a huge advantage, and it opened up opportunities that just wouldn't have existed, say, 30 years before. There's also enhanced opportunities for outreach and promotion, especially with photographs and images of great aesthetic value. So for example, I've worked in collections where we've really wanted to emphasize that a collection is open or that a collection is available to the public. And one of the things we've been able to do is digitize parts of the collection, especially parts of it which look really good, and we've been able to promote it via social media, and that can be really effective. And to be honest with you, I think there was once a time where something like that was a great advantage, but now I think it's something that's becoming more of a necessity, if I'm being entirely truthful. Moreover, digitisation can also be a way to reduce handling or reliance on physically touching the original media. And again, this is something that I've seen in other places I've worked. Sometimes you'll have certain materials which are in very bad condition, but get requested a lot. And ideally, you want to reduce the amount of handling that materials come under. But also, you do generally want to make materials accessible. That's generally the main purpose of an archive. So digitisation is one way to get around that. Digitising an item and making it available digitally can allow you to reduce the amount of physical burden that you're putting on that item. And also, it's relatively easy to do, depending on the intended level of quality. You could, in theory, digitize an item with your phone simply by taking a picture. The only thing I would note is, as mentioned, the actual quality of what you produce would be far less than, say, if you used a hybrid scanner, which obviously would be a lot more expensive. But the point I'm making is that generally digitization is a lot easier to do than it would have been, I would say, even as little as, say, 20 years ago. There's far more options than used to exist, and I think that's a huge incentive to a lot of organisations. And lastly, I would say it's worth noting that there can be environmental benefits if it means that you're able to recycle more and be less reliant on physical originals. So if you work in an environment where you're still producing large numbers of paper records and you need to keep these records for whatever reason, there is an argument to say that you could digitize them and that would allow you to recycle the originals. And I think within the current climate and current discussions about how organisations can be more environmentally friendly, I think that's one of the that could be a real incentive for organisations to undertake digitisation. Okay, but digitisation does also have a number of costs and considerations. And the first thing I would say is that digital media can be much more easy to delete, corrupt, or lose. And there is also a long-term risk of digital formats becoming obsolescent, and that the media we need to access digital items can go off the market. So, for example, if you digitized an item, say 30 years ago, and you put it in a floppy disk, you might find that it's a bit difficult to access that item. And you know, you could say something similar with DVD players. DVDs were very popular as maybe as early as 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. But now many laptops, many computers don't have they don't actually have the physical dimensions to play that. So that's another thing that you need to think about. And that's a problem that you're far less likely to have with something like a physical photograph. Um, Although digital storage is definitely getting cheaper, for very large files it can still be quite considerable, especially for audio-visual materials, which easily can take up quite a lot of space. And it's worth thinking about as well, if you say digitize the contents of a 500-page book and you create a JPEG image for every file and you create a TIFF master for each image as well, you know, the amount of storage space you eventually need can really, it can very quickly increase, and that can also cause problems when you migrate, say, onto another format or where you need to move the items elsewhere. So although storage is getting cheaper and you know, there's more storage options than there ever was before, you know, I would still say think about where you're going to store items if you're going to digitize them, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. The other thing I would have to say is that digitisation in practice can be a very long and laborious job. I've did digitisation projects where you're literally spending all day scanning items and adding metadata. That's just something to think about, you know, and you know, especially if you're scanning larger items or if you're trying to get a higher quality output, it can take a lot longer. And lastly, I would always recommend considering the copyright status of your materials, as there can be severe penalties if you put them online illegally. So one thing I would say is that because it's so easy now to put stuff online, I think sometimes there's maybe a culture where we become a little bit, I wouldn't say negligent, but maybe a little bit complacent with making sure that what we put online meets certain legal standards. And you could also add GDPR to this as well. I think that part of the need for that legislation was because I think our attitude to information in the online age hasn't been quite as careful as it maybe perhaps should have been. Okay, so let's talk about what you would think about when planning a digitization project. So the first thing I would say is maybe decide why you want to digitize. And you may want to do this for a number of reasons. And the reason you want to digitize a collection and the motivations for digitizing a collection can actually have a real impact on the sort of approaches and methodologies that you take. So for example, if you're digitizing for large scale access, that would likely mean that you would need to consider, say, for example, the copyright status of your materials. If you're digitizing just because you want to have physical copies as a sort of preservation, strategy, then you know that copyright status is probably less needed. So that's something to think about. The second thing I would say is that it's really important that you assess your capabilities and choose an acceptable final output. So this is very important, and it's worth remembering that the higher quality you aim for, the more difficult the project becomes. For example, if you want to enhance the resolution quality of captured digital images, then the amount of storage space you will also require also increases, because with the more pixels, you're using more bits and bytes. When assessing your capabilities, it's also important to consider if you may be better outsourcing parts of the project, which might be especially helpful if you're converting old audio-visual materials, for example. So if you're trying to convert an old reel-to-reel or vinyl disc, it might actually be better just to outsource that. The other thing I would say is, by all means, consider benchmarks in terms of quality, both in terms of the digital quality and applied metadata. So, for example, if you're digitizing images, then I would consider factors such as resolution and color quality. And I would also maybe think very closely about what sort of formats you want to use. So, For example, if it's again images, you might want to think, are you going to keep a TIFF master with a JPEG access copy? Are you going to use PNG, which I understand isn't highly recommended? That's something you would need to think about as well. And of course, the different formats you use would mean different file sizes, and there may also be different requirements for how you store them. Some formats are more modern than others. So for example, I do know that some archives, for example, only put their masters in TIFF because they see it as one of the few reliable long-term formats. Others will make a PDF because they think that offers a sort of longevity that other formats don't. So ideally, you do want to think a lot about the sort of formats you're using and how you're going to store them. I would say as well, you would probably want to think about how you're going to back up the items. So for example, you probably want to back them up in more than one place. And you would also want to use some sort of storage, cloud storage facility if possible as well. So again, these are the sort of things I would be thinking about if you're digitizing a large collection. Planning time is also highly important. If you have a 5,000 item collection, then knowing whether the average time it will take to digitize each item is 2 minutes or say 5 minutes is absolutely important. This may seem like an arbitrary distinction whether it takes 2 minutes or 5 minutes, but think about it logically. If you have 5,000 items and it takes 2 minutes per item, then it's going to take you a minimum of 166 hours to finish that project. If it's the latter, so if it's going to take 5 minutes per 5,000 item, then it's going to take at least 416 hours. So even although it's a small difference, 2 minutes to 5 minutes, it's not a lot. If you multiply it and you scale it across a project, it can really add on a lot of time. And a couple of things I would recommend is in the early stages of a digitization project, just see how long things are taking you and then use that to estimate your progress. And also I really can't emphasize to try look for automation where possible, especially when accessing metadata or creating derivative access copies. So for example, if you're digitizing a large collection and you have access to Photoshop, maybe see if you can automate the creation of derivative JPEGs from the TIFF masters. Lastly, I would also really recommend that you quality control as you go, and especially in the early stages of a project while you're still ironing out the process. It's much easier to fix a common mistake after 50 items than it is after 500. So quality control is a big part of digitization. And even at the end of a project, you would also want to consider what went well and what didn't go so well, and maybe where things could have been better. That's always something I would recommend. Okay, so let's also look at some examples of digitization projects, and especially projects where organizations have digitized large quantities of their materials and made them available online. Okay, and lastly, please see some references and further reading. There's quite a bit here, but of all the items that I would recommend you look at, the Melissa Terrace Digitizing Images for Information Professionals book has a particularly good reputation. I think I used that book from a master's or an earlier edition of that, and I found it included a lot of really good information. The other ones as well, I think the technical guidelines for digitization projects from the Wellcome Trust is also highly recommended. And of course, the National Archives always have something worth looking at if it's to do with archives. So yep, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and please feel more than free to add any comments or suggestions below. Thanks again. And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.